So I want to thank everybody for coming. As a part of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, we are passionate towards increasing awareness, representation, and fairness to create a safe and welcoming space to foster change and better reflect the communities we serve. Disparities in access to care and treatment is just one of the many unique obstacles diverse communities face in regard to managing their mental health. When we discuss mental health, it is impossible to overlook the challenges that face underrepresented groups. We are dedicated to working together to create an equitable and inclusive culture that's smart about mental health, not just for 1 month, but each and every day. On behalf of AFSP Illinois, thank you for coming and being a part of this discussion. If you have any questions for our panelists, please type them out in the chat. We will answer as we can. And we will also follow up with you if you do not get an answer to your question. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to start with Catherine Martinez, and she's going to introduce herself a little bit.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a United States Navy veteran that served just shy of 4 years. I was medically discharged due to an injury incurred in the line of duty. I now work for the Travis Manion Foundation, where I work closely with veterans and families of the fallen to teach children about character. But beyond that, I sit on the board of directors for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention in Virginia. But I also sit on the Joint Leadership Council of Veteran Service Organizations, which is an organization committed to advising the governor on all issues pertaining to veterans and their families. And with my background of serving, I'm just honored to be here today to have an honest conversation about mental health, and especially as it pertains to women veterans.
Thank you, Catherine. Up next, we have Alex Silva.
Hello, my name's Alexander Silva, and Alex Silva, and I'm a new veteran, and learning the ropes along with a lot of other veterans. But I'm manager of military programs for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and if it's okay, I'd like to just kind of, for my own comfort, just acknowledge an elephant in the room and say that I'm really glad to be here, and I'm very cautious about wanting to be on a panel and talk to women about what their experience is, and that's not what I'm here to do. What I'm really here to do is, it's because it shouldn't be up to our women veterans to tackle these kind of issues alone, especially when we're working with systems that are not necessarily built with women in mind. And so my goal today is just to make sure it's resoundingly clear that AFSP is in this fight with you. And yeah, thank you so much for letting me participate.
Thank you, Alex. And next we have Laura Grimes-DeLapp. I hope I said that right.
Yes, you did. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this conversation that is definitely needed. I am an Army veteran. I served 3 years on active duty and 6 in the reserves. I've worked with veterans since I've gotten out of the military, both with my husband with PTSD, and then as an advocate for veterans and especially women veterans. I belong now to a group called Tri-State Women Veterans. We just actually had a conference this last weekend, which gave me some time to talk to some about what they experience. I'm a mental health counselor. I'm licensed in Illinois as a licensed clinical professional counselor. I worked for almost 10 years at the VA. I worked in private practice and community mental health settings and been a part of different organizations that serve veterans. So I'm really happy to be here today and to have this conversation for women who are struggling and veterans who are such a minority population as part of the veteran culture.
Thank you, Laura. All right, we're going to get started with our panel now. So I will read the information and have the question, and then you guys will each have an opportunity to respond. New findings from the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs indicate that the suicide rate of women veterans is more than double that of civilian women. The impact of suicide on women veterans in particular is more profound now than ever. Between 2020 and 2021, the suicide rate among veterans increased to 24.1%, nearly 4 times higher than that 6.3% increase among male veterans, and much higher than that 2.6% increase among non-veteran women. And the proportion of women veteran VA healthcare users with service-connected disability increased from 48% in the fiscal year 2000 to 73% in the fiscal year 2020. What are some contributing factors to this?
I guess I'll start. I'm not sure if you wanted to start in the roundabout, which we introduced ourselves or not. But when it comes to these statistics being reported, I feel a lot of the times they're being underreported, especially as it pertains to women getting connected with the Department of Affairs. To bring in some other statistics, which I feel contributes to this, back in 2000, 4% of the veteran population were women, and it's projected that in 2040, that 18% of the veteran population will be women. And it's actually considered the fastest demographic in our country. So when we have those numbers in mind and we look at why the suicide rate is increasing, I feel it includes self-reporting, because a lot of the time women don't feel comfortable with that self-identification of being a veteran. I personally struggled with my own identity since I was medically discharged. I felt I didn't deserve to call myself a veteran because I got out before I could finish my service obligation. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. And so when we look at these numbers and we see that women veterans, it's being reported this way, we have to look at those who are choosing to self-identify as veterans. And then we look at their accessibility to care. And while the Department of Veteran Services is continuing to grow and expand to be more inclusive to women and have them in mind in their programming, we look at our country as a whole, and services for VA isn't exactly equitable everywhere. The access to care is important, but having equitable services across all VAs is just as important. And I'm going to stop there to allow my fellow panelists to answer here, but I feel a part of answering this question is looking at the information that currently exists. And some of those contributing factors may be the fact that we're still not quite ready to handle the influx of women veterans that are coming to VA, let alone encouraging women to self-identify.
I absolutely agree with that. For my own part, I didn't consider myself a veteran until maybe 10, 15 years ago. And when my service ended about 30 years ago, due to the fact that I didn't serve in combat. And women, I feel like, have been minimalized in their service. They've been told that you can't be in combat, so it doesn't matter. And I realize that now that's changing and more women are going into combat services, but women have always been a part of any type of military campaign or war, and serving in some ways. They weren't allowed to be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder until in the 80s, which I think had a big effect on women and how they viewed their own service. I think where suicide thoughts come in and is part of the fact that they don't feel they belong. And for so long, women have been told they don't belong in the military services. And they've experienced things, not only combat, but military sexual trauma, that they don't feel they can talk about. They don't have someone to connect with. At the VA, my first experience at the VA was with a nurse taking my information and typing it into a computer, and I don't think she ever looked at me a single time. Now that is most likely changing now. However, that's a big factor. If women don't feel heard, if they don't feel safe, they're not going to disclose that information that's so important to getting out their feelings so that they have a place to go instead of resorting to suicide. And I do believe that when that emotional pain becomes so strong, that is where our women go towards suicide.
Super well said. On this one, I don't think I have a whole lot except for the fact that when we talk about contributing factors to suicide, we are talking about a public health issue that has no single cause. And when we talk about things, about factors, every one of the factors that can affect the general population can affect women too, and sometimes very differently. And so you take all these things that just were said and you put that on top of issues around a veteran being able to access care and perceive that they are able to access care and actually follow through on accessing care. And that can be really, really difficult. And yeah, but other than that, I'm here learning too. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was really great input. So our next question is, what can family members and friends do if they think their loved one is struggling or experiencing suicidal thoughts?
Ooh, can I get a recovery for this one?
Yes, you sure can. Go for it.
Right. I think that one of the things that's really, really helpful is to recognize that even if we're not a therapist, even if we're not a researcher, even if we're not longtime volunteers and we're not connected to this space, that we have a really, really important role to play in the people around us that nobody else can. And that's true for a professional, but it's also really, really true for the people in somebody's life. And a lot of people can probably attest firsthand that you can't be somebody's emotional rock and also be their therapist, right? And knowing what our role is and what our role isn't. And something that I think can be really helpful to frame that is that in the military, it's inscribed throughout doctrine that we can't accomplish our mission without teamwork. And that means that knowing what our role is and trusting other people to do their job and using that kind of a model, support and treatment are both incredibly important, but they're not the same thing, right? So to recognize that while a professional has a very, very important job, the people around somebody are the people that a professional sends that person home to. And one of the huge indicators of whether somebody's able to make a successful recovery is the social environment, the people around them, the people that are aware of what's going on and are enrolled. And that's a step beyond it being just supportive, right? And so just recognizing that our job is not to be a fixer. It's to let our veteran know that they're not in this alone. And despite what it can feel like sometimes. And I think the last thing I could say is that it's very common to come across the clinical word we use was perceived burdensomeness. But the belief that you're a burden on other people by asking for help and sometimes it can be very frustrating to say, oh, you're not, I don't mind at all, and when we really mean it, but to let people know that it's not a burden to help somebody, it's a privilege to help somebody, and to be thankful for the opportunity that somebody gives us to help them and to know what that means. That's my part.
I agree. I think it's very important for family members to be aware of what's going on and just to be willing to spend time with the veteran, maybe listen to some of their stories that aren't always comfortable in those experiences, and to just provide them a safe spot to go to. Listening is key.
I'll add on to that by saying it is important to create and foster an environment where people feel open enough to express these emotions. But I will say, as family and friends and those in the community, we know who we're around all the time. I don't like the saying of warning signs. I like to describe what's outside of that person's norm. I know when my coworkers are upset, I can tell when they come in acting differently. And one of the first things I do is check in. It's okay to say, hey, how are you doing today? But if someone is experiencing suicidal thoughts or is expressing suicidal ideations, it's okay to be direct. Are you thinking about suicide right now? And some people may not think of that they're harming themselves, and it's okay to explore those questions a little bit more. Again, by being direct. We don't want to beat around the bush. We want to be intentional with what we're asking in order to get the answer that we're looking for. That way we can connect them to proper supports, whether it's dialing 988 and pressing option 1 to be connected to the Veterans Crisis Line, or making that decision to dial 911 to have EMS services come over, or it's you personally make that decision to be a part of this and take them to the emergency room so that clinicians and physicians may assist further. I feel we all everyone has a role to play in suicide prevention, and in order to create a suicide safer community, it's being open and receptive and having that willingness to just check in. And it's okay to have honest, real conversations about mental health and say you may not feel comfortable enough to do so. Tell someone. It's okay to bring someone else into the conversation, and it may not be that you don't want to. You may also be experiencing an issue with your own mental health, and having those set boundaries is very important to have. So please never feel guilty if you may not feel ready or comfortable to have these types of conversations, but know that there is options and supports available to you. And I'll again reiterate 988 pressing option 1 for the National Suicide Hotline, but also 741-741 for the crisis text line, which is a great alternative to those who may be mute or deaf. It offers an opportunity to communicate in a way if someone may not be verbally ready to communicate these thoughts as well.
All great points. Alex, I see you have your hand up.
Right. Well, I also don't want to, if you have anything more too, I just, I get really excited when I hear people talk about this. My piece was just to add to what Catherine is saying, that it's difficult sometimes to ask somebody for help. And it's also difficult sometimes to reach out and tell someone that you're concerned about them, especially when people are really, really good at having good reasons to not do the thing they don't want to do. Right. And sometimes one of those barriers can feel like, well, I don't have really good rapport with this person. They're not part of my life. They're somebody, this would be really awkward for me. And when talking about that authentic, real conversation, it can be really helpful sometimes to recognize that the fact alone that somebody is willing to reach out and tell someone that they'd like to know what's going on, and to be upfront about this isn't a normal conversation for me. I feel a little bit awkward. I feel a little like I hope when you see somebody who's reaching out to you despite those things, that is a good indicator that that person cares about you enough to bypass their own discomfort, announce it, and set that example about being able to talk about things that are hard to talk about. And so that apprehension can be your sword and shield. It doesn't just have to be a barrier.
Absolutely. All really good points. Actually, I wrote down privilege to help someone. I think that's such, and everyone had really good points, but walking with someone in this journey, it is a privilege, because it is a journey. And so I appreciate all those things you shared. So what are some risk factors involved with women veteran suicide that we need to be aware of and what we can watch for?
I think in addition to many of what we would say are the common signs, because the experience for everyone is different, is I think what's added on for women veterans might be pain that they're experiencing and not been able to get proper care for, sometimes because of wait times at the VA, or waiting for consults, or barriers to getting to those services, lack of other resources such as counseling. I know right now I've talked to a couple of veterans who say their counselor can only see them once a month. That may not be enough for someone who's experiencing suicidal ideation. And I know the crisis lines get them in and talk to them, but for the ongoing counseling to really dig into those issues that they need to resolve, counseling is more important to have better access to that. I think isolation is a big problem. Women veterans don't always know how to reach other women veterans. A lot of groups are springing up across the country of women veterans, which is great because it does draw women out, and being able to talk to others. But we don't identify in the same ways that men do. We don't wear hats. So you have to be really having a conversation with someone before you might find out that they're another female veteran. And I think having more connections would help help women, I think that's definitely a risk factor.
I want to hone in on the risk factor of social isolation, and I'm going to refer back to my previous response as it becomes a self-identification. When you're struggling to claim parts of your identity, it plays a huge factor of whether or not someone may experience or go through a mental health crisis. Who am I? I don't belong here. Those thoughts play over and over in your head, and I feel in order to combat this, it's having that opportunity of making sure that our women veterans feel welcome. And again, like Laura said, tying them to resources that will aid them specifically. As a woman veteran, I've never felt more included or welcome than by being a part of women veteran specific programming. I'm a graduate of the Mission Continues Women Veterans Leadership Program. It is the first time I'd ever been in a space entirely of women veterans. And it's such a powerful feeling that I can't describe. I was the youngest of my cohort at 27, and the oldest person were in their late 60s. To unify women veterans and have direct and open conversations about life experiences that they had or military experiences that they had, and come together to address these because we understand what we've been through, whether it's within our own rating or MOS or job, whichever term you would like to use depending on your branch, or maybe they have experienced military sexual trauma, sexual harassment, or even ageism, and to go on is misogyny throughout their experiences. And when women veterans are expressing these things, normally those outright, it's being in a space that allows people to be open and direct about these experiences, that someone outside of the space may think it's a risk factor to be as open as we are about these experiences, but it's sometimes not. Sometimes people are venting, and I think that that's something to consider when speaking to women veterans, that a risk factor may not be us opening up, it's us opening up, and we want to have a conversation about what we experience. But again, to dial back to social isolation, I feel that's one of the biggest risk factors that I feel needs to be discussed as it pertains to women veterans, as I feel some of us are often put into a box or category that when we choose to explain more about our service story or time in service, that in of itself is a risk factor, but it's just us feeling safe enough to finally express those thoughts and feelings.
Is it, if it's okay, so to what Catherine's saying, so when I met Catherine, it was in the context of an interview around AFSP work, and I was having a hard time keeping up with the amount of examples of applied knowledge in communities for women veterans and for other kind of programs too. Man, I still sometimes have said, you know, oh man, I need to ask Catherine if there's any organization for this or that. And that's on top of just the administrative pieces. Catherine does labor, you know, in this kind of a space. And I really think I just wanted to say that I really look at Catherine as an authority person about ways that people can get involved with the veteran community, and to remember that 3 zeros, there are 45,000 plus nonprofit organizations registered with the IRS who are doing things for veterans. They're not all there for women, and they're not all suicide prevention, but there's some examples like that of how we can absolutely be connected in our local communities. And there's probably something within a drive that you don't always see, because when you have women veterans who are such a small portion of the veteran population, especially as you look at older generations, it can be really hard to go to a veteran group and expect to see other women there. And so just to recognize that is seen, and it's not that it's not that those things don't exist, it's that you might have to look for them a little bit more than you should have to.
Before we move forward to the next question, I would be remiss if we also didn't discuss the lack of purpose women veterans experience post-service. I mentioned those questions of who am I, what do I want to be, and it's a commonality amongst women veterans that this is a risk factor when it comes to potential mental health crisis or suicidal ideation. So I want to highlight alongside social isolation is that lack of purpose is another big topic for women veterans when we look at risk factors.
Thank you to all of you. Anything else you wanted to add to that? We can always move on to the next question here.
I did see in the Q&A that how can we help a woman veteran who is experiencing a lack of purpose, and want to express that by introducing a variety of resources and organizations as well as programs. But I don't want to just put that blanket statement out there. It's having an honest conversation with that woman veteran on what they do and don't like. There are so many amazing programs out there available for veterans, which ranges from beekeeping, learning how to treat bees, or having a garden, or even doing recreational therapy by learning how to sail, or even just going to adaptive sports programs. So I would have an honest conversation about the interest of the veteran that you're working with, and then being able to explore the availability of resources and programs out there. Like I will shout out that Wounded Warrior Project has a variety of programs open to post 9/11 veterans, and have that opportunity to explore what's out there, from their physical health and wellness programming to, again, that recreational therapy component. And even the Department of Veterans Affairs has a recreational therapy program that is open to veterans seeking care there. And all they need is a referral from their primary case manager. So just want to toss that out there as well.
Can I provide a quick anecdote? I separated 6 months ago, and I had not lived less than 500 miles away from anybody who had any business with me outside of the uniform. So something that I think is really important to know, and I'm not sure if this is everybody else's experience here, but the military isn't where you work. It's who you're supposed to be. And when we talk about the topic of identity, when somebody is coming from a place that has a very proud heritage and are highly trained and understand their role and are really truly part of something bigger than ourselves. When I separated, I think about everything people go through in boot camp. I separated, and my experience was, yep, that's your whole checklist. Thank you for your service. Have a great day. And that's it, right? And I'm fortunate enough to have been able to come into it to something that I can continue, something that I consider to be a purpose, but to figure out, okay, that person who is honestly a different person, right? So I'm gonna say, I can't speak for other people. Sergeant Silva is not Alex in a uniform. That's a different person. That's a non-commissioned officer who's charged with very specific things and is required to be a certain thing to other people. And it's like overnight that person is gone. And figuring out who you are again, and especially after a long time or really, really powerful experiences, it's something that I'm learning again with everybody else about how these things can impact women veterans, but it's something that impacts veterans sometimes. So your question about about the lack of purpose has kind of resonated for me. I appreciate being able to kind of share that piece.
Great, so we're going to move on to the next section here. All really great info. I appreciate all of you for being here tonight and helping us get this mission across. The VA has adopted a public health approach to suicide prevention by extending its programming outside the walls of the VA through community partnerships statewide. This includes public health messaging campaigns like "Don't Wait, Reach Out" and "Keep It Secure." Other prevention programs and legislation have also been implemented, like the amendment to the Female Veteran Suicide Prevention Act, to ensure that the most effective mental health care and suicide prevention programs for women veterans are being utilized. Are there suicide prevention gaps and vulnerabilities you are aware of for women veterans that we should also be aware of?
Can you repeat the question?
I sure can, because I said that really fast. So Are there suicide prevention gaps and vulnerabilities you are aware of for women veterans that we should also be aware of? So how can we help fill in these gaps?
Thank you for repeating it. I do live with a traumatic brain injury, so I really appreciate your willingness to repeat the question. So
I just know my brain is like all over the place sometimes. So if you have to ask me to repeat, I do not care.
So to address like some gaps that people should be aware of, it's for those living with chronic conditions like traumatic brain injury, like post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, endometriosis, so on and so forth. These chronic conditions are overwhelming to live with on a day-to-day basis, what we live with. And when we see a care provider or a therapist, and they ask you on a pain scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? And I myself have rated it pretty high, and they're like, you don't look like you're that high. What are you really feeling right now? I live with this. And in order to accurately describe what I'm feeling, I'm describing what I'm feeling accurately. But I've lived with it for so long, is that in order to maintain a decent quality of life for myself, I have to repress those outside physical features of what does pain look like? Am I scowling my face? Am I crying? Am I overwhelmed? It's just that over time we get used to it. So I feel one of the biggest gaps is downplaying those who live with chronic conditions, and some people downplaying that they may be over exaggerating the symptoms when we've had to accommodate to make those around us comfortable when we are expressing our own discomfort. And then beyond that, another gap that needs to be addressed is, even though the population of women veterans is small within the veteran community, the subsex within that is women that are people of color as well. I've had to go through several therapists to find the right one for me who would understand a little bit more what I've experienced as a Latina woman. Someone who is willing to not only go over what I experienced as a woman veteran, but the other part of my own intersections within intersectionality, which is ensuring that all parts of my identity are being addressed. And so some of the best ways that our community can come together to address this is building a suicide safer community. It's ensuring that all of us have that role in suicide prevention. And then when we look at community care accessibility, we're not just looking at other big health entities. We're partnering with organizations that are inclusive and receptive to the intersections that women possess when seeking care. Maybe it's those specialists that constantly work with those who live with chronic conditions. Maybe it's those who specialize in working with marginalized populations that goes beyond just women veterans and focus on BIPOC or the LGBTQIA plus communities. So just looking at those is some of the ways that some gaps, but also some ways we can work to address it.
Catherine, those are some really good points that you bring up. And finding a therapist is very individualized, and it's much harder to find a therapist if you are of a different ethnicity, to find someone that you can truly connect with. And most of the VAs, and I can only speak for a couple, that I'm familiar with, is the wait times. And also, if you don't connect with your therapist, it's seen as such a negative by the VA, and it's very hard to get transferred to a different therapist who might suit your needs better. This is what we have available right now. And I think that makes it much harder. There are some community care consultations as well. But that is something very hard to do. And I think it's very important for not only women, but anyone who's seen a therapist to be able to connect with their therapist so they can truly express themselves. Another gap that I would see is for some, our younger veterans, maybe our younger female veterans who are mothers, may not be able to get to all their appointments or all the treatments they need for lack of childcare, which is not something, that's been addressed by the VA. Where the clinics are may be another barrier. I know one VA that I've been in has their clinics, and they would report it as being closed in, but it's all glass. And so women can be seen there sitting, and they feel like as men are walking by, they're being pointed out. And again, that makes them very anxious in sitting in some of those environments. And I think being aware of that and making sure that women feel comfortable in whatever environment they're in is very important.
I'll just add one more thing that just came to mind is some of the apprehension behind alternative forms of therapy, which can include somatic exercises, horse therapy, recreational therapy, like I mentioned earlier, is that some people may not find the value in this, but it may be what our veteran is seeking. So I feel when it comes to community care access, being more receptive to these alternative forms of traditional sitting in a room therapy would also heavily increase the probability of women choosing to go to therapy if there were more variety and options of what type of therapy is covered.
Anything else to add to that? I really love how you touched on finding the right therapist. I think anyone who's on the mental health journey needs that validation that just because you found a therapist and you sat on the waiting list and you got in there, if you get in there and it's not working for you, it is totally okay to find someone else. I like to compare it to having a bad haircut. You wouldn't keep going back to the same person for a bad haircut. Why would you keep going back to someone who's very valuable for your mental health? Our next question here, what are some ways to reduce access to lethal means for someone in a suicidal crisis while also respecting their rights and autonomy?
I can take a swing at this one. Something that's really important is that this topic can go the wrong direction in a lot of different ways. And it's something to think on ahead of time that we don't ever want to find ourselves in a debate with somebody who's in a crisis and is reaching out because they're in pain. And so it can be a thing where somebody might want to go toe to toe and argue about whether or not their risk is enough to warrant taking away the firearm and or the lethal means. And we can't do that. We also might encounter somebody at risk who are very, very enrolled in a narrative around what it means culturally to have somebody remove their lethal means. And so something that I think can really help to bypass those things is that we don't necessarily need to win an argument to keep somebody safe. Sometimes we can let somebody know that, hey, maybe this is something that is excessive, but I would feel so much better if you just let me hold on to your firing pin until we can, regroup. And that could mean until a therapist is able to, or a professional is able to make that decision with the veteran. And it's okay to make those kind of things about ourselves and to say, hey, maybe it's overkill, right? But I think sometimes that can be an easier way to do it. Yeah, just a little trick.
I think those are great points. For me, I would think that two super great questions to ask in any situation where you're facing the possible suicide and suicide ideation are, what do you need right now to stay safe? And how can I help? And that way it leaves room for the individual to just speak about what it is they're experiencing and what might be needed to help them in that situation.
I'll just have an alternative response is the importance of having a safety plan, especially if it is known that a veteran has a weapon. The Department of Veterans Affairs does provide gun locks. The state of Virginia also provide gun locks with the 988 number on it. So that is an opportunity to have those honest conversations about it, but also the importance of maintaining your weapon securely and in a safe way. But again, want to really reinforce the importance of a safety plan and having direct and honest conversations, especially if you have a veteran that's at imminent risk and they describe in their plan to use a weapon. That is a moment where you need to call 911. It's no longer a 988 call because it is emergency. So it's very important to just, again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be direct and ask the questions you're really wanting to ask at that time, as if you don't, you won't get the answer that you're looking for, but would overall encourage a conversation on how to properly keep a weapon stored safely within your home.
And if I could take that point and also add that sometimes it's very hard to be fully open and honest with somebody who's reaching out to you about their concerns. And it can be common for somebody to kind of by reflex talk about how they're feeling in this exact moment. But when we talk about things that where somebody could be at risk with a firearm, or when really talking about suicide risk, to make sure we're also asking, maybe you're not feeling this way today, but at your worst, or what would it take? Or are there circumstances that could happen that would change that? You know, sometimes you can see people who wait until they're over a suicidal crisis to reach out so they can say no on the question, you know, because that's their current answer. So really just focusing it around somebody's worst day, and when talking about safety plans and recognizing that those things are not just administrative steps in a process. These are things we need to treat these like a letter to ourselves when we really need it. And to remember that it's nice to not be in a crisis, but if we are vulnerable to them, or we have things that can put us there, to think about those moments and not just how we're doing in the middle of an average work day where we're bringing the conversation up, right?
I agree that it's good to have a plan. I also agree that it's good to have people to reach out to, and professionals aren't always available. And we do have those crisis line numbers. And some people might not be willing to call them for different reasons. So being connected with other people is very important, to other people who are just like you, or at least similar to you. And that's where many of the women veterans groups come into play. The group that I belong to, Tri-State Women Veterans, it's located in Evansville, Indiana. It was developed after a university had a women's conference, and a single woman said, okay, where else can we go? What can we do to do this again next year? And that group has grown from a handful of people. And I was very fortunate to be around early on in some of its early days, and have watched it grow to a greater number, to where there's many more women attending the monthly meetings, the third Tuesday of each month. And also to the yearly conference that just had its 14th annual conference this past Saturday. And it's many different services participate in that. And so the women during that time can get connected with veteran services, with a lot of the nonprofit groups, as well as the VA itself. For me, it was great because my VA primary care physician was there. And I was like, okay, this shows that she cares, coming out on a Saturday to talk with these women. And that has been very helpful for me. For women who want to join, all they need to do is contact that organization and say, hey, I'm a veteran, and go to one of the meetings. And it's a very welcoming group. And they talk to each other. They have many different activities that can help women get involved and feel like they have a purpose of continuing to serve, which is very helpful, I believe, in the prevention of suicide. So if you want further information about that, I'm happy to provide it, and also to the phone number to one of the officers. So.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. The information and discussion has been so valuable and informative. So we were going to check in with participants' questions, and I know one of them was about Laura's women's veteran group she's in, and she just talked about that. Another comment I had was about the Down the Leash program, so I just shared that with everyone. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We would love to answer them. Alex, did you have something else you wanted to add on the national level of resources or anything?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. Thinking about the question I was asked about gaps and vulnerabilities for women veterans that we should be aware of. Culturally, women veterans, they need to be seen, right, by the general population, right? And when we talk about the general population and the word veteran, it's not always captured what that word even means, right? So it can be a challenge when already working through a lot of narratives around the word veteran. And when a lot of times somebody might build their prescriptions or their solutions, even if they are veterans, just around their own experiences. And when that's something that happens and gets momentum, then it can easily leave people behind. And so not everybody who serves in the military suffers from combat trauma, right? And very much so, not all military trauma is combat related. In fact, in today's world, most of it isn't. We see way more military sexual trauma than we do combat trauma, at least from my experience working in a clinic. And so there's some things that we need to expand the narrative on to make sure we're capturing people, and other places where we kind of need to redirect it. But that, no matter what those messages are, we need to make sure that people are seen, and women veterans, it's a top priority. Like it really, really is. And this is what's so exciting about AFSP being in this scene in a more, in a bigger step now, right? So I have a bit of a bias, as a volunteer who's on the programs team, but I believe that AFSP, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, shows up for the community that it serves and the communities. And so for that, if you're not aware, we have 74 chapters in all 50 states and Puerto Rico, and the work we do is driven by volunteers. And our ability to scale and mobilize programs is something that the veteran suicide prevention world has not had up until now. Again, take my bias for what you will, but we've been engaging in these communities for years, but it's typically been in an extracurricular or kind of an improvised context based off what that chapter is capable of doing in that moment. But to recognize, we're the leading suicide prevention organization, and it's not close. We approach the topic with all kinds of different tools, right, as a public health issue. So we fight suicide through partnerships and research, and we have impact measurement teams, and our programs are truly built by and for the communities that they're for. Even on policy, we have a very, very robust policy team that does things at state levels, federal levels, grassroots levels, and keeps an eye on every state and community that we have access to. And I can keep going on, but the biggest thing that AFSP is bringing to this fight is that we approach every single one of these areas with a relentless authenticity. And that's what I think is something that is what helps us capture things, right? So when we can approach this topic of suicide without losing the gravity of the situation, but with a sense of optimism, right? I mean, we think about all the suffering, right? And the trauma and pain that comes with suicide, and especially in all these issues we've been talking about for women veterans, right? You think about that scope and that scale. AFSP, we're building a culture that can meet those things with some warmth, right? And with that, and with some authenticity, but most of all with agency. And so to be aware that we are able to make these machines move because of our volunteers. And I'm excited to say that as far as the question is concerned, sorry, is that we're assembling a dream team right now, advisory committee, to develop a new education program for veterans. And we're asking every step of the way, what can we do to make sure that everybody feels seen, especially those who haven't felt seen before? And so all of that, in short, we're doing this in national levels and chapter levels, and I wish I could share the entire list. Let me just send me an email, but we're all in this fight together, and we're not going to leave women veterans behind. And I'm just very glad to be able to be part of this and to show up. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for participating, and our attendees for being here. It is essential that Congress, the VA, veteran advocates, the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and other interested stakeholders work together to ensure that our women veterans have access to and receive the care they need. We want to conclude with a list of resources for you to utilize and share with other women veterans and their loved ones. Thank you to the panelists, the DEI committee, and all of the participants today.